In the silent, suffocating swamps of Louisiana, a family discovered a food source so plentiful it would end hunger forever. Their secret was a nightmare dressed as a solution, and it was walking the back roads, looking for its next meal. Louisiana, 1901. The world was charging into a new century of progress, but in the dense swamps around Shreveport, time stood still. Here, families lived in isolation so complete, they forged their own rules, their own traditions, their own monsters. The first to vanish was the Morrison family, James, his wife Sarah, and their 3 young children. They were traveling to a new life, their wagon loaded with dreams. It was found days later, abandoned. The horses, still harnessed, paced nervously. All their belongings were there, clothes, tools, a child's doll. But the family was gone, no signs of a struggle, no footprints. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. They wouldn't be the last. Over the next 4 years, over 40 people vanished on those rural roads. Families, traveling merchants, all following the same ghostly pattern. A wagon found abandoned, belongings untouched, no bodies, no clues. The local sheriff, Augustus Landry, was baffled. In his 20 years, he'd seen everything. But this was different. This was silence. This was nothingness. Panic began to seep into the community. Whispers of a swamp devil, a curse, a predator that left no trace. But the truth was far more human, and it was hiding in plain sight. Retention line. The answer wasn't a monster from the shadows. It was a family. And the next time they came to town, you'd never guess the horror they brought with them. They were the best-fed, most prosperous family in the swamp. But their secret ingredient wasn't a recipe. It was a crime. And they were about to become suppliers to the entire town. While families vanished, one family thrived, the Broussards. They lived on a remote, ramshackle property deep in the wetlands, a labyrinth of decaying sheds and cabins ruled with an iron fist by the matriarch, 75-year-old Cleodos Broussard. To outsiders, they were just a large, strange, and deeply isolated clan. They rarely spoke, moving with a silent military precision. They were led by Cleodos's son Alcide, a tall, grim man with dead eyes, and his half-sister Cordelia, whose cruelty was as sharp as a knife. They had 14 mouths to feed, yet they never seemed to want for anything. In fact, they were doing better than ever. Their secret? Meat. They began appearing in town with astonishing quantities of it, perfectly butchered, expertly salted, and wrapped in clean cloths. They traded it for supplies, and their business was booming. The local merchant was amazed. Where were they getting so much game? The meat was different. Lighter than venison, more tender than boar. It had a peculiar sweet smell that was vaguely nauseating. When he asked, the family's main trader, a young woman named Eulalie, would only mutter one thing: swamp game. But the children were the real tell. They would come to the butcher's shop and smell the meat on display with the expertise of connoisseurs. They'd whisper to each other in an old French dialect, comparing it to something they knew, something better. They weren't just eating well, they were developing a taste for something no one could imagine. Retention line. But one man started connecting the dots, and what he discovered buried in the mud would prove that the missing families never left the swamp at all. Father Gilbert Horton didn't believe in swamp monsters. He believed in sin. And when he followed his nose, he found a hell on earth that would haunt him forever. The only person suspicious of the Broussards was Father Gilbert Horton. He'd tried to visit their property to offer prayers, but was always turned away. He noticed things. The family's numbers seemed to change. Their children had a disturbing, well-fed glow, and a strange, sickly, sweet smell sometimes drifted from their land. After another family disappeared, the priest took a walk near the Broussard property. The air felt wrong, and then he smelled it, that same sweet, rotting smell, but stronger. He followed his nose. Recent rains had washed away the topsoil, and the earth had given up its secret. Not bones, not yet, but everything else. A child's shoe caked in mud, a piece of a woman's dress torn violently, buttons, a wedding ring, a tiny ragged doll stained dark with something awful. This was no animal attack. This was a graveyard of possessions, evidence of a system, a business. Father Horton ran to Sheriff Landry. He laid his findings on the desk, the doll, the ring, the shoe. He presented his terrifying theory. The disappearances and the Broussards' sudden prosperity were connected. The family wasn't just finding food, they were creating it. Sheriff Landry, a practical man, was sickened. The pieces fit. The abandoned wagons were always found near Broussard trails. The family went quiet for days after each disappearance, then returned to town with a fresh supply of meat. The next day, the sheriff and his men descended on the Broussard property. What they found wasn't a home, it was a factory. Retention line. Inside the sheds, they found the truth. And the truth wasn't just murder. It was an assembly line of death, built with chilling, efficient precision. Welcome to the butcher shop where the meat was always fresh, the supply was endless, and the customers never knew they were eating their neighbors. The Broussard property was a nightmare of efficiency. The first shed was a slaughterhouse, wooden tables stained black with old blood, an array of knives and bone saws, hooks hanging from the ceiling. The smell was a physical blow, a mix of death, salt, and that same nauseating sweetness. This was no crime of passion. This was a well-oiled machine, one area for the initial kill, another for skinning, another for cutting and sorting. They had it down to a science. A second shed was for preservation, barrels of salt, smoking racks, drying lines. They weren't just feeding themselves, they were running a business. A third shed was a warehouse, with shelves organized like a market, labeled in French, not by animal, but by cut and type. And in the back, the final horror. Pits. 6 of them. Filled with a jumble of human and animal bones, a pathetic attempt to hide their harvest. The sheriff estimated they contained the remains of over 40 people. They arrested who they could, old Cleodos, Cordelia, and 5 of the youngest children. But 7 others, Alcide, Eulalie, and more, vanished into the impenetrable swamp, knowing its secrets better than any tracker. The investigation was over. The scale of the operation was clear. But the real horror was yet to come. It was in the confessions, retention line. When they questioned the family, they expected denial, maybe tears. What they got was a business report from the minds of monsters. Meat is meat, family is family, business is business. These 10 words were the mantra of a cannibal clan, and they believed them with all their hearts. In the interrogation room, Cleodos Broussard wasn't remorseful. She was proud. To her, this wasn't murder. It was pragmatism. She explained it with cold, brutal logic. They had a large family to feed. The swamp provided. The people traveling the roads were just another resource, like deer or fish. Why let them go to waste? She spoke of harvesting and processing. She detailed how they'd perfected their techniques over 4 years, how they'd assign roles. The young ones were scouts, luring families in by pretending to be lost. The adults handled the quick and quiet work. Everyone had a job. Cordelia was even worse. She talked about the meat with the pride of a master chef. She explained how different ages and body types yielded different cuts, how children's meat was more tender, how they seasoned and prepared it to be superior to anything sold in town. They had regular customers who specifically requested their meat. The children, conditioned from birth, saw nothing wrong. When asked what they ate, one simply said, "the good meat." Another explained that supermarket meat didn't feed properly anymore. They were gourmets of the grotesque, their palates ruined for anything but human flesh. The family structure was a tangled web of inbreeding. Siblings, cousins, parents, and children intermarrying for generations. This isolation had created their own morality, their own world, where this was all normal, necessary, even righteous. They had looked at the world and devised the most efficient, terrible solution to hunger imaginable, and they were proud of it. Retention line. At their trial, they wouldn't beg for mercy. They would school the court on the principles of efficient butchery, and their final words would be a warning to the world. The hangman's rope ended the life of the cannibal matriarch, but it couldn't kill her ideas, because the most terrifying monster isn't a person. It's a concept, and concepts can escape. Cléodose Broussard was hanged. She went to the gallows without an ounce of remorse, her final words a prediction that others would someday see the genius of her ways. Cordelia died in prison, refusing to eat anything but bread and vegetables. Her body gave out, but her convictions never did. The captured children were sent to orphanages, their minds shattered and rebuilt. They were ghosts, forever haunted by the taste of a forbidden food they couldn't understand was evil. Most met tragic ends, unable to adapt to a world that condemned their normal. The 7 who escaped into the swamp were never found. Hunters told stories of skeletal figures moving in the mist, of finding campsites surrounded by human bones. Had the fugitives turned on each other? Had their own horrific tradition consumed them? No one knows. They vanished into the legend of the swamp. The authorities burned the Broussard property to the ground. It burned for 5 days, the fat-soaked soil fueling a fire that tried to purify the evil there. But you can't burn a memory. For years after, floods would wash bones and trinkets from the soft earth, the swamp forever refusing to keep its secrets. This story isn't about demons. It's about us. It's about the brutal calculus of survival, the power of isolation to warp reality, the human capacity to systematize anything, even horror, in the name of efficiency and family. The Broussards show us that the line between civilization and savagery is thin, and that the most terrifying monster is the one that looks back at us from the mirror once it's decided that some people are not people at all. They're just meat. The Louisiana swamps kept their secrets, but history never forgets. This is a warning. Humanity is only ever one generation away from forgetting its own. If this story of the line between family and nightmare chilled you, then share it. Share it with someone who understands that true horror needs no ghosts. Subscribe now for more stories from the edge of history, where reality is always darker than fiction. And tell me in the comments, could isolation and desperation ever justify the unforgivable? The conversation is what reminds us of our own humanity.